So I'd like to welcome everyone to the University of Illinois at Chicago and to our very special event commemorating 50 years since the release of the report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kerner Report.
The Kerner Commission was a watershed moment.
In the wake of the terrible riots and violent protests that had exploded in the black sections of many of America's cities, the President gave us our marching orders. He charged us, the Kerner Commission, to investigate the riots and recommend action, again, not only from a law and order standpoint, but also in regard to their deeper causes.
This country was conceived and built on the embedded notion of a hierarchy of human value. It's in the DNA of every system and structure that we have, and it's deeply embedded in the unconscious minds of almost everyone.
Then they talk about we're going to create a democratic government. One of the first things they said were blacks were 3/5 human beings. And, women didn't have rights to vote. How do you build a democracy on those?
My African ancestors, as most of African people, didn't volunteer to come to this country. Think about that now. Not as human beings, as property.
The wealth of this country, as we know, was built on the back of African slaves and from the resources and the land taken from native people.
And as regular citizens, we've been trained in a box to think of our problems as that of civil rights, something domestic, not something that's broader like human rights. Who enforces our human rights in America?
Let your search be free, the President told the Commission members. Find the truth and express it in your report. And that is exactly what the Kerner Commission famously did, which, as it turned out, not only shocked the conscience of the nation, but greatly upset President Johnson.
The Kerner Commission was important and is important. You still have this codified record of the reality of racial hierarchy as it's never been captured before.
Our basic and most famous finding was our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Great and sustained national efforts were required, we said, not only to combat racism, but also to greatly expand social programs, including those against unemployment and low wages, poverty, inferior or inadequate education and training, lack of health care, and bad or non-existent housing. The report also made strong recommendations for improving the conduct of the media and the police. But, unfortunately, misinformed about its contents and distracted by the Vietnam War, President Johnson rejected the Kerner Report.
There's intersections between what Great City Institute research project has produced and the Kerner Commission report.
As I was reading the report, I was really struck by a lot of the recommendations are some of the same recommendations that we put in the reports that we did on joblessness. Things around skills, training, access, recruitment.
50 years later, not too much has gotten better. We have yet to address the inequalities around housing, education, employment, and race relations, as well as police relations with the community.
What we see with young people is that you see 3 generations of incarceration. You see 3 generations of poverty. You see young people who have no hope.
They don't have the jobs or the income. So they go to the streets. They don't see a future. All they see is tomorrow or today. Many don't believe they're going to live because they've seen so many deaths. Many of them don't have examples of success in their communities.
But there is not that common focus to look collectively together how we raise the quality of life to create what Martin Luther King was talking about, the beloved community.
We do not want to make a commitment to pull them up. And until we get that collective, until we see the humanity of a helping hand to my brother and sister, and I think a helping hand to another member of the human race, We're going to continue to see these issues and these problems.
It's like you can find $50,000 a year to house me in a penitentiary, but you can't find $25,000 a year to get me proper health care, education, and housing.
The levels of brutality and hatred that accompanied the centuries of denial of the humanity of both indigenous and African people. It's an anathema to who we think we are as a country. And facing that reality is frightening, and it's hard.
But until we learn to work together in a collective, I think this government and the private sector, being a financial institution, will continue to pick our communities and this country apart.
We've got to create an integrated movement. Civil rights, human rights, environmental, anti-oppression.
I know we could do it if we could communicate, but it's really hard today to communicate.
The Great Cities Institute here at UIC is modeling for the world to have brought together all of these wonderful people, both the authentic community voices as well as the policy-making voices.
Had we took heed to the Kerner Commission report, implemented some of the things they said, I think the world would be a different place.
You know, during the civil rights movement, the media and everybody used to often say, the civil rights movement saved America from destroying itself.
America has to do this work. We will not survive as a viable democracy if we don't do this.
How can we get these things done when present times are so politically tough? First, I think we can take heart from the fact that the great civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, who I think is a living saint, and others, began in a terrible and depressing time, worse than these, of Jim Crow. And Jim Crow was a law, not just practice. Rigid segregation, harshest racism. The odds were overwhelmingly against them, but still they courageously resisted, persisted, and ultimately prevailed.
There is no greater hope for us than active, complete, and total civic engagement to realize and begin to realize the potential of this democracy that we have.
There is more activism right now than I've seen in my lifetime.
What you see in the White House is the resistance to the progress that was being made.
Every generation, when faced with a crisis, got some type of concession from government. But in order to do that, every generation came together. They put their differences aside of race, class, political beliefs, religion, to say we have to do something as a collective to remind the government that they work for the people.
I have a responsibility to transfer that history that I lived and that older people live to younger people, so they will realize that hopes and dreams prepare this world for the future.